Good evening. Welcome to 10 Questions, What is Loss? I'm glad you're here and that we're here together. These are devastating times of great loss. For nearly a year now, we've been battling a global pandemic that has to date taken 1.39 million lives worldwide. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, friends, colleagues. And as we gather here tonight, COVID-19 is surging across this country. The climate crisis is wreaking havoc on communities around the world, threatening our very existence. Wildfires, hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, and extreme heat occur with greater frequency and ferocity, upending, displacing, and taking more lives and livelihoods in their wake than ever before. Earlier this year, researchers from the University of Arizona warned that 1/3 of all plant and animal species could face extinction within 50 years. Democracy, something we hold so dear in this country, is being challenged by forces seeking to sow confusion and erode trust in we the people, our institutions, and our way of life. And across all of these things and so many more, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities endure greater suffering and loss than most. Access, justice, freedom are not dealt out in equal amounts for all. And yet, perhaps there is something powerful and redeeming in addressing the question, what is loss? Let me backtrack. If every day you go through the same routines, they become what we would call natural. There's nothing natural about them, but stay long enough with something and it becomes naturalized. As in, wasn't it always this way? Won't it always be? Remember shaking hands? Remember hugging? What we often call natural is learned so well that we don't give it a second thought. 2020 has been a year of denaturalization. I think it would be safe to say that we're not experiencing things as we did before. Our lives have become unfamiliar to us, and yet, simultaneously, we've quickly adapted. I think this is what many call the new normal. Losing what has been familiar is uncomfortable. However, in this moment of discomfort, we also have the possibility of reimagining everything, our lives. We know things not only through an encounter with them, but also by understanding what they are not. What is the other side of loss? Love, resilience, hope, survival, life? Some say the ability to experience love, resilience, hope, survival, and life is contingent on one's acquaintance with loss, and vice versa. Patrisse Cullors is an LA-based artist, activist, anti-incarcerationist, and one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. In her piece, A Prayer for the Runner, she says, "What do you do when you're not safe in the place you live in?" This is an acknowledgement of loss. Speaking about her work, she says that when someone is stolen from us, a piece of ourselves is stolen. For Cullors, her artistic practice is about putting herself back together again. According to Cullors, the practice of saying the names of the ones we have lost comes out of the need to lift folks up, to invoke the spirits of ones that have passed on, so they remain present. We invoke the names of the ones we lost in order to tell their stories. Would you join me in taking a moment to say their names, to write the names of those we have recently lost, either collectively or personally? Let's write their names so that they are present with us tonight. The chat is open. The chat will stay open now, and you can continue to add names. Amidst so much loss, we are here. And remembering our mortality reminds us to be alive. And while we're sharing tonight, I have a special request. It means so much to us to hear from you, and especially in these moments when we can join together on the chat. But please use your discretion in the chat so that we don't distract from the evening's presentations and discussion. For those who are joining us for the first time, 10 Questions is a course offered by UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture and simultaneously a public platform for thoughtful engagement with our extended community. It's here with you that 10 Questions brings together the resources of the university to build capacity in this time of urgent need and great precarity. The format for this evening will include a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists, followed by conversation amongst them. Our students, and you know who you are, will then immediately gather in small group discussions in Zoom breakout rooms, and everyone else will remain here in the webinar for some specially curated mid-program engagement. We'll then welcome our students back and finish out the evening in a Q&A with our esteemed guests. Our first panelist tonight is Jorja Leap. Jorja is an adjunct professor at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, the executive director of the UCLA Social Justice Research Partnership, and co-founder of the UCLA Watts Leadership Institute. As an anthropologist and recognized expert in gangs, violence, and systems change, she develops, coordinates, and directs real-life scholarly efforts that involve research, evaluation, and policy recommendations at the local, state, and national level. Welcome, Jorja.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with everybody to discuss what is an ineffable human experience, and that is loss. It is something we can't avoid. In fact, it's a cliche that has been used for decades. There's 3 things no one can resist: birth, death, and taxes. And at least 2 out of the 3 has something to do with loss. I want to talk about loss in a very specific way this evening, about a group that is known probably to everybody who is part of this evening, a group that is known very well, a group that is stigmatized, a group that is demonized, a group that is often blamed, even as recently as the political climate allowed for it. And I think it's not a mystery that tonight I'm going to talk about gangs. And I'm going to talk about what I have learned about loss from gang members and from those who are gang involved. It seems sort of obvious that these individuals that I'm going to share with encounter loss, but it doesn't just have to do with crime or with violence, although I'm going to touch on that. But I will tell you that for the past 20 years, gang members have been my teachers about loss in ways that I could never have imagined and would have been at a loss to describe. I'm going to share with you some photographs of some of the gang members, not all, but some of them who have been my teachers. And I want to talk about the lessons I've learned from each one of them about loss. So let's go to the first photograph, please. Now, in the lower right-hand corner of this photograph is someone who is an extraordinary human being and has been and continues to be one of my teachers, not only about loss, but about life itself. And that is Father Greg Boyle, the founder, the genius, the cultural icon behind Homeboy Industries. And there with Father Greg is somebody identified on the photo as Smiley, Irvin Penamino. And Irvin earned this nickname. It was not his gang moniker, but it was the nickname that was applied to him once he came to Homeboy Industries. And Irvin was an individual who was filled with joy, who wanted to change, who at one time had been a member of that most notorious of gangs, MS-13. And he was a young boy, an immigrant, unprotected in this country when he was recruited by MS. He later left the gang and became very much a part of the soul of Homeboy Industries, and literally everyone there, including myself, loved him. And it was a horrifying November morning when we came into Homeboy and learned that the day before, Smiley had been waiting for the bus to come to Homeboy and had been shot dead. Now, what I learned about such a shocking death was astonishing. The suddenness of it, the violence, the lack of preparation, the inability to even imagine that there would be an absence when Smiley had once been in our presence. And loss for me and for everyone at Homeboy was filled with terror. It was the idea that this could happen at any moment to anyone at any time. It had nothing to do with being a gang member. It had nothing to do with being good or being bad. It had nothing to do with being a vital part of the Homeboy staff. It was random, it was brutal, it was unthinkable. And it literally left a hole in all of our hearts that could not be soothed. What I learned, what we all learned, and what Father Greg taught about in those moments and then days and weeks that followed was that this kind of suddenness was part of life. And he used to say, we have to hold onto life loosely. I listened to Father Greg say those words, but I kept looking at this photograph of Smiley and could not resolve myself to the suddenness, as I said, and the violence of his death. And so in certain cases, loss is random, loss is inexplicable, and we have to live in the space of that uncertainty. Now, Smiley was not the only person I met and became extremely close to at Homeboy, and this was one of the gifts of being in such a space. Next photograph. This is Bertha Cordova, and when many people think of gangs, they think of men. But Bertha had been a gang member when she was a girl. And this was the second type of loss that I learned about, the loss of childhood, the loss of innocence. Bertha talked to me about being in a gang, being in the county probation system, being in the California Youth Authority, hiding drugs on herself, hiding guns on herself, beating up other women, and how there was no innocence in her childhood. And here she is with her daughter, and she was devoted to ensuring that there might be losses. While there might be losses in her daughter's life, her daughter would not lose her childhood. She gave her daughter the gift she could never receive. She made sure the loss of her childhood was a loss that would not be repeated in the next generation. Next slide. The man that you see here experienced one of the most unbelievable losses, a loss that I refer to as life and death. He experienced the loss of his freedom. This is James Horton. James was on California's death row in San Quentin prison because he was mistakenly identified as the shooter in a multi-victim homicide. It was later proven that he was not even on this scene. And after years on death row, he was released from San Quentin. This man courageously endured the loss of freedom and the threat of death in a way that was unimaginable. And with that kind of loss, he also taught me and so many others about hope, about perseverance, about looking forward in the darkest situations unimaginable. I've had the honor of working with many other men who are incarcerated on death row right now, some who await execution, not knowing when that date may ever arrive. And what I've discovered through James and through the words of others is that death row is frequently a place of hope. And even with the loss of freedom, it was important for men not to lose their souls. And this puts me very much in thinking about the last person I'm going to talk with you about. Next slide. The man with the microphone, the man in the royal blue shirt, is Elder Michael Cummings. He's also known in Watts as Big Mike. And Big Mike is a man who early in Watts was involved with drugs, with violence, with brutality. And the loss he suffered in certain ways was one of the most devastating, the loss of self. And yet, after incarceration, he redeemed himself and sought to heal the community that he had once sought to destroy. And he found himself, and inherent in his loss was redemption. I share these brief vignettes because these four individuals and so many others have been my teachers about death, about freedom, about childhood, about self, and about redemption. I hold their lessons to me, and I hope even with this brief introduction tonight, you will be able to hold their faces and their lessons with you. I'm hoping we can talk more about this as our discussion moves forward later this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jorja. What a encompassing view of loss and particularly vulnerability in our very inequitable populations. And I appreciate your spreading the word of what you have learned, because now we can be the learners alongside of you. Thank you, and we'll look forward to talking more in a moment. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jenna Cavallo. Jenna, an assistant professor in our Department of Design Media Arts, is an animator and media artist working with VR, motion capture, and video game platforms. Her single channel and interactive projects explore the role of symbolism and narrative in personal, collective, and digital memory. Welcome, Jenna.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Georgia, I'm blown away by your beautiful talk and your incredible work. Um, Losing someone I loved changed the way that I see the world and process things. And my particular fascination in making art has since been with the ways that memory is fallible and the way that time, distance, growing, and forgetting help us to make new connections and new narratives about the people and things that we've lost. So, I would like to frame my perspective on loss in two ways. Next slide, please. First, I want to talk about images. I agonized a bit over how to really give context for my experience of loss, and what kept presenting itself to me was the process of fading memory and how it is similar to the way we store images. In a past life, I worked as a digital media archivist, which is how I developed a particularly symbolic and sentimental relationship with digital media compression. And in working on an archive, thinking about the way we compress and read images has served me in making sense of my own memories. So I'll talk a bit about graphic shorthand, decontextualization, and the compression process that causes what is referred to in digital media as loss. Next slide, please. Loss refers to the result of an algorithmic compression process by which some data in an image is disposed of to make the image easier to store. Um, every time you save a JPEG or upload an image to Instagram, that image is experiencing loss. Lossiness abstracts an image, but we've come to expect a little bit of that in every single social platform that we engage in, which is particularly interesting considering that now that our lives are online, how we take in media and how we interact with our loved ones is more interrelated than ever. Not only have we lost physical connection, but we've lost image fidelity. Obviously, the greatest fidelity we can hope for is to stand in front of somebody. Next slide. It's been interesting to see videos of really young kids who understand the mechanics of losing connection, dropping out of video chat, or the significance of a low quality image. And I wonder how they'll remember their grandparents and teachers' faces in the years after this pandemic. Next slide. And I feel the need to begin my talk on loss with lossiness because a low fidelity image has this uncanny ability to connect us to feeling and to meaning. And we take this for granted. Even with information physically removed from an image, it's not like we expect an equivalent loss of feeling or a numbing effect, the way we might inaccurately, in my opinion, expect time or forgetting to numb our feelings for someone that we've lost. Here's a person that I love, or I should say, here's a digital facsimile of a 35 millimeter photo of someone I love. And it's compounded over Zoom, but compression algorithms have thrown away some data in order to reduce the total size of this image. And still, to me, this image no less represents the person I love. This idea seems so natural now. This is how digital media works. Next slide. But it's interesting to note that John Berger talked about the decontextualization of images and how our imaginations allow us to connect an image that is once, next slide, twice, next slide, and however many times removed from the actual context of the subject to a real feeling. The context has changed dramatically. In fact, it is lost. But no matter how distantly removed, the image can connect us, next slide, to the feeling of the original moment. Our imaginations very stubbornly do that work for us. Next slide. Here's a drawing of the person from before, just from memory. I couldn't recall too many details, but because of its lack of specificity, incidentally, it has a greater capacity for projection. Next slide. Scott McCloud talks about our ability to connect meaning and the uniqueness of any face to an abstracted face in his book, Understanding Comics, The Art of the Invisible. And as an artist, I think a lot about how visually and mechanically image information loss, image abstraction, image decontextualization in this context shares so much in common with memory. We experience loss and then stretch to connect feeling with meaning, but for better or worse. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I am, a step removed from the emotional connection that I'll assume you've all formed with me in this short amount of time that I've been talking. I'm playing a joke, but also, do you remember the color of my eyes? Is it easier with this loss of visual information to reframe me as somebody else and to make a narrative for me or my living room? I'll come back. Our memories don't work like high fidelity image slideshows. Some memories seem very clear, even if they have lost data. And some memories are so general that all we can do is project narratives onto them. We spend time crafting narratives in order to connect meaning to memory, sometimes subconsciously, and that unique reinterpretation process motivates how we interact with the world after a loss. I'd like to read a quote from Virginia Woolf. She says, I can only note that the past is beautiful because one never realizes an emotion at the time. It expands later, and thus we don't have complete emotions about the present, only about the past. If I could have my slides back, please. Here is a Google Street image of the house I grew up in, not very far from UCLA. The second way I'd like to frame loss involves mourning, and I'll tell you about one of the projects that came out of this conceptual connection between the idea of lossy media and how it relates to memory that I began working on in order to express my understanding of what I lost. My mom passed away, and that day I remember sitting in the hospital room and staring out a window, and I could almost feel my memories of her, of this house we lived in, and of everything inside it start to feel more general, with little disparate bits of clarity here and there. And one main goal of my work has been to explore this feeling and to reconnect my memories to meaning, which in my case necessitates stories and gameplay. Next slide. This piece I'm working on now is called Amber Row. It's an experimental VR game in which I've recreated my childhood home living room and use it as an inventory space. Objects in the game are memories, and your goal in the game is simply to gather them. Giving them away to other characters in the game will help you learn about the one person who has left them behind and is now gone. Next slide, please. Each object is related to a distinct memory of mine. Next slide. And as you progress through the world of this game, collecting these disparate memories, gaining perspective on this absent person, the world of the game falls apart. It loses its structure. It becomes its own memory. Next slide. Your experience in the game leads you to one final moment of clarity with the person who left these memory objects behind. And she has nothing to reveal to you. This was all a game of personal necessity for me. Next slide, please. My own answer to the question, what is loss? Is that loss is the profound event that breaks everything. Loss makes us confront our humanity, but it is also the subsequent transformative process that follows, during which our minds let go of information, our perspective changes, and our memories become especially extra super subjective, which is natural. And as an artist and a fellow mourner, I want to propose that we remember with purpose. And loss can be a motivator for us to be genuine and to reach out and to get involved in our communities and politics, to make heartfelt appeals, because our imaginations do that work, to reconnect what has been lost to meaning, so that all that is needed is a creative effort by each of us to forge a narrative and to let that be your path forward. Next slide. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenna. Connections between loss and memory and the need to tell stories. That's really very, very rich. So, and such beautiful work. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third and final panelist, Michael Eselun. Michael is the Dr. John Glaspie Chaplain in Oncology Care for the Simsman UCLA Center for Integrative Oncology. In addition to oncology work, he has worked extensively in palliative care, hospice care, and acute psychiatric care. Through his work, he addresses the deeper questions of life, mortality, and meaning with vulnerability, insight, and humor. This is Michael's second appearance in the 10 Questions program. Last year, he spoke eloquently and shared his thoughts in response to our final question last year: what matters? Welcome, Michael. We are so pleased to have you join us again.
Thank you so much, Vic. It is such an honor to share this space with two such amazing women. Thank you. In thinking about and consternating about how I was going to approach such a huge question, I jokingly asked Chad, who is our IT guru and all around great guy at the Sims Man Center, if he wanted to speak in my place. Oh, I'm sure they mean loss of data, right? Well, I'm going a different way. The well-known Buddhist author and teacher, Pema Chodron, offers us this in her book, When Things Fall Apart. I used to have a sign pinned up on my wall that read, "Only to the extent that we expose ourselves over and over to annihilation can that which is indestructible be found in us." It was all about letting go of everything. I invite you to think about 4 or 5 things that make you who you are. That if anybody's going to know you at all, they're going to know these 4 or 5 things about you. That you're a gifted athlete, a talented artist, that you're passionate about politics or your faith community, you're a devoted grandparent, or you're known for your beautiful physique and great head of hair. That would be me. Imagine none of that is true anymore, or not in the same way. Who would you even be then? Is there an essential you who dwells beneath all of those labels to which we would attach ourselves, all those hats we might wear? What's more, is he or she worthy of love? Is he or she capable of giving love? As painful as it may be to entertain those questions, they do reflect the most profound spiritual journey through loss, toward essence, if you will, that which is indestructible. It's a journey that so many cancer patients must take in a compressed, accelerated kind of way, watching piece by piece of one's identity slowly slip away. If I'm no longer the supermom who never misses a soccer game or a birthday party, who would I even be then? Am I even still the mom? The thing is, it's a journey we all must take. Life affords us each that guarantee that we will all lose everything. Everything that we are, everything that we have, everything that we love. How do we make peace with that? Is it even possible? I wonder if one key to living a successful life might lie within our capacity to come to peace with the inevitability of loss. What's more, might that peace even be seen as a kind of gift, giving us a glimpse every now and then of that which is indestructible within? The Buddhists would teach us that we should be well practiced at letting go, that grasping, clinging, reaching is a sure pathway to suffering. As an illustration, we only have to look at how so many of us are coping with this pandemic. When can we get back to normal? I want life back the way it was. When is this going to be over? I'm an avid swimmer. I swim every day. I remember last March when my gym announced that because of the virus, they would be closing the pool for up to 2 weeks. 2 weeks? I can't live without the pool for 2 weeks. Oh yeah? Just wait. I hear similar sentiments from so many newly diagnosed cancer patients. Can't we just go back to the way it was before? Can't we go back to 4 weeks ago before this diagnosis? I see this as a kind of paradox that while, yes, holding on can lead to suffering, I also find that there's life force in that, in the reaching, in the yearning, in the striving. Chemoinfusion clinics are filled with patients who have signed up for guaranteed suffering, for the possibility of more time, more life, a future. Universities are filled with students striving for, investing in, creating a future. When we're young, the future is almost a member of the family, a character in our biography. Look at how much attention and intention we invest in the future. It animates our lives. It shapes so many of the decisions that we make. As we get older, possibility diminishes right along with the future, and the past becomes a far richer member of the family. Memory, stories. Stories that might soothe us, bring us peace, stories that might help us explain ourselves to one another or to ourselves, or stories that might even haunt us. But either way, stories that offer the possibility of meaning. In a sad irony, some of us will even lose those. How do we make peace with that? Is there any meaning to be found in everything that we're going to lose? I'm not so arrogant as to think I have any answers at all. What I have are stories, my own and those of countless patients I've walked beside, patients whom I would just as soon call my teachers. And I also have a growing faith at this stage of my life that moving closer toward any paradox and holding the space for two competing realities to be true might just offer a pathway to peace, if not wisdom. April was a great gal, mid-40s, vibrant, professional wife, mom, 2 great kids. She had this exceedingly rare, exceedingly lethal cancer diagnosis that also happened to be horribly disfiguring. The doctors gave her this awful prognosis, nothing more we can do. And she greeted that news with this kind of profundity and clarity. Michael, I'm dying, I know that. It's the truth. But you know what? It's only one truth of many truths. Her openness to that statement and her willingness for it to shape the remainder of her time was truly something to behold. And there are those who cling so valiantly to those 1 or 2 aspects of their identity that without them, life simply wouldn't be worth living. That clinging is what keeps them going. It gives their life some meaning. There's the passionate professor who by any reasonable standard should not have been in a classroom, given how weak and immunocompromised she was. And yet even her oncologist saw the truth of that. I see this, you're a teacher, you have to do it, so go teach, just be careful. I remember meeting a young mom in her 30s in the hospital not long before she died, and she was busy writing a journal, writing letters to her 11-year-old daughter to be read in the distant future. Oh, that's so Beautiful, I said. No, it's not, she said. I'm just nagging her into the future. She was still just being a mom to the very end. And there are those who adapt to the loss, find a new identity or a new version of the old one. Randy was a great guy in his mid-50s, had a advanced colon cancer diagnosis. I had so many wonderful conversations with him over the last couple years of his life. Not long before he died, I was walking him out of the clinic and we were still chatting when we got out in the hallway. Up walks another patient, gingerly making her way to the entrance of the clinic. She's on a walker. Randy says, "Excuse me, Michael, just a minute." And he goes and he holds the door for her with a big smile on his face. "There you go, sweetheart." And he comes back to me and he says, "You see, Michael, the way I see it, that's my job now, to be kind. That's what I do." Now, his professional life had been animated by intense financial pressures and competition, commercial real estate. It had all been distilled and refined down to that as one who shows kindness. Cancer had robbed him of so much, but it didn't take away that career opportunity. It didn't take away that place to still find meaning. Kate was in her early 60s, newly diagnosed with a recurrence of breast cancer, now stage 4. She was a spiritual seeker, an artist, a musician. She played cello in a local chamber orchestra. While raised an Episcopalian, she converted to Judaism much later in life, but not because of marriage or some such conventional reason, but because she said, "I love the humor in Judaism, and besides, there's no hell." She also loved the questioning nature inherent in Jewish study. Though any articulation of who or what is God, how does prayer work, what happens on the other side of life, was simply left undefined, because she experienced her spirituality in community, playing music in community, praying in community. She didn't pray when she was alone. She also shared with me that she had been a survivor of childhood sexual assault, an experience that left deep wounds, to be sure, but not the least of which was a crippling fear of dying. And the essence of that fear was, what if I just disappear? There it is, ultimate loss. I asked Kate if she'd ever had what any of us might call a peak spiritual experience. "Oh, yes," she said, "playing a big, lush piece of music like Handel's Messiah. I got to play that once in Cleveland, full orchestra, chorus, the works. It was transcendent to be in the center of the creation of all that music, to be enveloped by it." Kate, you just told me that your biggest fear was that you would disappear, and yet your peak spiritual experience was one in which you disappear, if you will, into the creation of that music. It couldn't possibly be about you and your cello in that moment. And yet without your cello, it wouldn't have been the same. What if dying is like that? What if the other side is like that? Surrendering into this larger harmonic reality in which our voice is an inextricable link, a piece of the whole. What if it's like that? She sighed into that. She exhaled into that. Sometimes we have to summon our imagination, come up with new metaphors when our fear of loss is so immobilizing. I love to hike, and for decades, I've taken a nearly annual pilgrimage to Yosemite because there's one hike there. It's simply given me my life back, more times than I can count, oftentimes a great crisis. About a dozen years ago, I came upon such a time, devastation, a spiritual crisis, really, which I would define as a time of great loss. Everything I had believed in, trusted in, collapsed right out from under me. And at first I thought, okay, I should maybe go to Yosemite, try to climb out of this, transcend it. But somehow it just didn't feel right. And so then I thought to myself, I've always wanted to see the Grand Canyon, hike to the bottom. I'm not getting any younger. Maybe instead of trying to climb out of this crisis, I should climb into it, into the earth, go down, not up, see what might be there for me. So that's what I did. For any of you that have made that descent, you know how staggering it is. And the wisdom that came to me was so concise and clear. The Grand Canyon is only grand because of what's been lost, what's been taken away, not because of one thing that's been added. One particle of soil at a time, letting go, losing itself to the water over the span of 5 million years, swept away by something so simple as water. I spent that night at the Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the canyon. It's a charming, historic, albeit Spartan compound dormitory-like cabins, communal dining room. The lovely man who served us dinner that night asked for our attention before we dug in. He wanted to offer a kind of invocation or blessing. My friends, I'd like to welcome you here, and I hope that while you're here, you'll take some time to be quiet and feel the specialness of this place, the power of it, the sacredness of it. It's like Jerusalem or Mecca for the native people. And he went on to say, and no matter how hard it was for you to climb down here today, climbing up tomorrow is going to be so much easier. Of course, there were incredulous groans from around the dining room. Yeah, right. And if not, he said, rejoice, rejoice, you got no choice. I love that. I come back to it again and again as a kind of mantra. Rejoice, rejoice, you got no choice. Sure, let's savor each vista, cherish each moment. Hold on, you bet. But with an oh so light touch and a willingness at any moment to let go. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Rejoice, rejoice, you have no choice. So much wisdom here tonight. I can't thank each of you enough. And we don't have to go away. This is a moment for the three of you to come together. Having shared your thoughts on loss, to just take some time to speak with one another. And I have this sense to honor the clarity and intensity that you bring to this question of loss. So let's spend some time together.
Well, I just want to begin, first of all, by acknowledging both you, Victoria, and Anne-Marie Burke, because I think you were able to bring three very different and yet complementary or integrated perspectives on loss. I also have to take a deep breath after Michael. And I feel like I'm going to have rejoice, rejoice, you've got no choice tattooed on my chest. And it really is, this represents so many different ways for us to think about loss and sort of make it part of our everyday lives, including what you said, Jenna, about the lossiness. I like that. It's messiness plus loss equals lossiness. At least that's what I was thinking as you were talking. So let's see. I'm interested sort of, as you've moved through life, how have each of you used your work with your personal circumstances? I guess because that's so much of what happens with me. I'm sort of interested to hear.
I'll jump in. In my role as a chaplain, there's a lot of wisdom in the way that you're trained, that you are not supposed to disclose or bring your own stuff to the table, but honor that your wisdom and your journey is informing the way you're able to be present with a patient. I kind of don't ascribe to that totally. I will disclose with patients sometimes what I'm going through, not to work out my therapy on them, but to kind of give the understanding that I know what they're talking about. And also, I'm asking patients to whom I'm a total stranger to be open and vulnerable with me. Basically, take your clothes off in front of me. And I can't ask them to do that, I feel like, unless I'm willing to expose myself too. And I also don't like to hold the posture that I'm the expert and I'm going to teach you how to do death and loss and cancer. I don't know. I'm not walking in their shoes. So I am their student and they're my teacher, and my role is to be taught about what's it like to be them. So it's an alchemy that happens between us and our experiences.
Yeah, I would definitely say that I bring my personal stuff to everything, to every conversation, to every um, artistic endeavor, and to every judgment that I bring with me on the outside world. My main mode of connecting with people really is to acknowledge the the sense of mourning that's in me, and to trust that it's in everyone else as well. Um, and so that has actually served me in connecting with people before I really know them very well.
Mhm.
And similar to how Michael says, everyone's experience is so different of loss and mourning that no one can assume that there's some kind of uh, master of the experience. And yet it's the diversity of our experience that really makes the conversation so much richer. Um,
Yes.
and I can't imagine, I mean, perhaps we're lucky for this, that in, in an art department, you wear your emotions on your sleeve. You talk about how you feel and what it's like to make with feelings. Um, and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, I can't imagine a time when I've ever held back.
Jorja, I'm fascinated to know how you make your connections when there are racial and economic class distinctions between you and the population you work with. How do you build that trust and
Yeah.
sense of communion?
Yeah.
It's been such a humbling experience for me, because what I've learned working in Watts and in South Los Angeles with gang members and working at Homeboy is color, gender, even socioeconomics is not as much as an issue as I realized, because what I felt and experienced and learned was that gang members have great crap detectors, and they know if you empathize, they know if you are sincere, and if you are there with an open heart, they're going to take you to their hearts. And I have seen Black gang members reject Black individuals who came to help, not always, but who came to help, because they said, they're not feeling me. They're not understanding. They literally, the empathy wasn't there. Now, look, I'm a middle-aged white woman. There are doors to experience that I will never open. But what I learned is, if the empathy is there, and if the ability to say, I don't know, can you tell me? I don't know, can you teach me? I don't know, can you help me? And, I had these moments where it was like, but you're a professor from UCLA. And I would say, but I don't know, and you need to help me. So I think it's that combination of being humble and walking in humility and authentic empathy, feeling through this, not a research technique, not something methodological, not something in my, qualitative methodology books, but that feel. And that's why I loved when Jenna said, both of you talked about feeling. And for me, that has been the most potent bridge across race, ethnicity, age, gender, economics. And also to say, I don't know, I'm stupid, teach me.
Yeah.
It's just it's just the honor of my life. I literally, and there are days it's horrible. And yet I always feel renewed by what I'm being taught. And it's just profound. And in the time of COVID, I got calls and texts from prison, from jail, from the streets, from people saying, "Are you okay? Are you all right?" And I would ask them too, "Are you okay? Are you all right?" I mean, it's just, loss is about attachment. And for me, that's the meaning of life. For me, that's where the learning and where everything comes.
From the, do you mean the meaning from the loss, or the meaning from the attachment, or attaching and then losing? Okay.
We know, you said this, Michael, we know we're going to lose what we look like, what we are, who we are, all these things. And yet we attach so deeply, especially to those we love. And especially after Smiley, I knew I stood the risk of losing these folk. That made the love, the attachment, the connection, all the more profound. It's the two sides of the coin. Attachment brings loss, loss brings it's just there.
I was going to ask, I mean, Michael mentioned immobilizing versus mobilizing loss. And I was wondering just kind of how that plays out for you in your position.
For me, Jenna?
Or, well, Michael had mentioned it, but I was wondering how it applies to Jorja's position.
You know, it is so, and I wonder for each of you if this is true. It is so meaningful to me to be part of a shared community. I am never dealing with the losses that I learn about or that I experience alone. It is always in this space with others. And it's actually, on the face of it, it's like, well, how are you sharing that with, gang members in prison? And let's be blunt, they're not in prison because they collected too many parking tickets. They have engaged in behavior that is often very difficult to understand, to process, to empathize with. But it's never immobilizing, because that shared community, that it is so, I literally feel held by it. And I hope I hold others in it. And that is what has enabled me to deal with these lessons. The stories, as I told Bertha's stories, the stories of someone who didn't have a childhood. How did I deal with learning that? With this shared community, with this understanding, with these, not just words, but these emotions that are exchanged. I'm wondering if for each of you, there is that shared community, or those you speak with, or those you share with, that turn it to, an ongoing mobilizing loss.
It's the story of my life these days. And I resonate so deeply with so much of what you say. I'm part of a community at the Sims Man Center, who I love these people like family. They're not colleagues at work, they're family. We share our losses together. It's very painful in this time of the pandemic to not be in the same physical space. They are generally all are significantly younger than I, and it feels wonderful to connect across generations and experiences, but mostly with the patients. And a lot of patients I meet, I know, I had one person tell me once, well, don't you know that inside every hello is buried a guaranteed goodbye? And it's true. Every time you greet anybody, say hello, there will come a time when you have to say goodbye. And with these patients, it's very clear. And because of the nature of my work at the Sims Man Center, we are working in the outpatient side. So I'm seeing people in chemo clinics, at least before the pandemic. I see them when they're diagnosed. A doctor might say, I'm giving somebody some bad news. Can you come be handy? It's not like being in the hospital where you only see them for this critical period of time and then you never see them again. So I have patients that I've known and fallen in love with for 9, 10, 12 years. And say goodbye, and I grieve. And other people in other professions say, oh, well, you have to keep professional boundaries and you have to keep, I don't do that. I carry them in my heart every day. And it's sad and it's hard and it makes my life worth living.
Hmm.
So it's the both and thing. It's that paradox.
Yes.
I know that you do. I'm on the other side of that experience. I inherited a genetic mutation from my mother's side that uh, makes me very kind of likely to get certain cancers. And when you mention community, it really is the first thing that came to mind was the medical community that I have been um, seeing for such a long time, who test me and keep me safe. And it has completely changed my relationship um, with hospitals. Just to know that there are people who are there, who care and who want you to have a good experience out of your life, whatever that may be. And I haven't experienced cancer myself yet, but um, there's absolutely not enough I can say about how much I appreciate the people who have made taking care of and considering and bringing into their lives cancer patients. To them, they are the world. To me, they are the world.
Mhm.
They are my community,
Mm.
and they help me.
It's interesting because I read a chat question from someone who asked me specifically, but Jenna, it just and both of Michael and Jenna, it intertwines with what you said. Someone asked me the question, do individuals join gangs because of a loss in their lives?
Mm.
And the short answer is absolutely. It can often be the loss of a parent. It can also be the loss of a loved one. It also can be the loss of control they feel over their own lives. But I think, and each of you is providing these incredible examples, and I see it, that loss leads to this need and this drive to be part of something bigger than the loss. And as I said, the community, when you talk about the caretakers, the folk who work with people at risk for cancer or people who have cancer, Jenna, um, and Michael, by your own example, these are all instances where people encountering loss are driven to connect. And I think it's part of the story of loss. And as I was thinking talking a few moments ago about cancer, excuse me, about gangs, I guess they're intertwined. Um, the losses drive all of us, myself included, to attachments to now, when it's an attachment to a gang, that is not ideal. And in point of fact, one of the reasons Homeboy works so very effectively is it replaces the gang.
Mm.
It is, we take the gang's got, if you take something away, something must take its place. And I think in a certain way, we're all moving down that pathway of there are losses, but there are things that we're attaching to, connecting to, that help us and help others transcend loss. Not deny its reality, but in a certain sense, transcend what it means for people. And we're not going to avoid it. I keep going back to what are the losses you can endure, even as a human being? And the answer is none of them and all of them. Someone else is asking a question here. Um, can any of the panelists comment on rejection as a loss? It's a great question.
Rejection really feels like it reflects on you as a person,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
And um, I know it's strange to say, but something that is comforting about losing a loved one is that you know they didn't want to leave you,
Mm,
they didn't want
mm,
to go. Um, and in a way, rejection or someone's choice to leave can be equally as painful, if not more,
Mhm.
because of that choice factor and the way that it feels like it reflects on you. But not knowing anything about your personal situation, my usual comfort is that if this was a rejection from a person, you hope that people do what they think is best for themselves and that it doesn't say something about you. Um, and my hope is that we all can really believe that. It's so
Mhm.
much easier said than believed. Um, but to believe that when we face a rejection, um, we are just taking care of what we need at the moment. Those are my thoughts.
I I've also got to say, there is a part of loss, and I sort of feel like I'm tiptoeing around it and I'm just going to boom, jump into it. And rejection often brings this up, which is anger.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot, we talk about loss and there's sadness and there's pain and there's mourning. There's also anger and at times rage. And loss will bring this to the fore as well. Um, I'm wondering, Michael, if you've seen it when people sort of rage against the dying of the light, you know, and the rejection. And I want to hear that. But for me, rejection with myself and as I've watched with others has often resulted in deep anger in not wanting to say, I don't want to feel rejected. I'm going to push this out there. I'm going to make sure someone else feels. I don't want to feel it. I want them to feel it.
And I think the anger is also born out of the expectations that we had and then the disappointment. And so I'm angry, which ultimately is about, I thought I was in control and I could make my life the way I wanted it, and I can't. So I am pissed. I'm pissed at the person who seems to have done it to me. But ultimately, it was my expectation that life was going to go in this kind of trajectory.
Yeah.
And there's a rejoice, rejoice, you got no choice question. I remember, well, young to me, he was in his 50s and he was a super fit cop, detective, patient, newly diagnosed with a really bad cancer. And he was somebody who was very much in his head, hard to get down into a heart space, but he was so pissed because he laid out for me how he had done everything the right way, ate the right food, exercised the right way, worked the extra hours so he could have his early retirement. And then he was going to do X, Y, and Z. And then he gets this diagnosis.
Yes.
Pissed off, understandably. And I think for so many of us in the human condition, coming to peace, not only with loss, but with uncertainty and that which with powerlessness, that we are out of control. We've got so much in our culture that lets us think we're in control. If we wear a seatbelt, get an alarm system, obey the laws, eat the right food, buy life insurance, I'm going to be just fine. And then what happens when you're not? Those are all illusions. When it comes to the big stuff, it's out of our control.
And you can feel that anger when someone passes away, when someone
Right.
dies. I mean, anger is absolutely a part of the grief process.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that is another one of those larger issues with loss, which is control
Mm-hmm.
and how illusory it is. And that's a space that's uncomfortable for all of us. What I've witnessed for so many, that ambiguity that we don't have control is so uncomfortable.
Rejoice, you've got no choice.
That's right.
Y'all, I really, really hate to put a pause on this conversation, but in the interest of getting our audience involved and speaking with you a little more directly with their questions, I am going to move us on, but not ending anything. So we're going to take a little break. And for the next like 12 minutes, I invite all of us to consider this extraordinary conversation and the wisdom and heartfulness of our three panelists. We'd love to hear your questions for them. Students, you know what to do. You go off to your discussion rooms and please come back with questions for these extraordinary guests. And we'll see you shortly. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the work that you saw during our break, and looking forward to sharing your questions, and let's just get right to it. All right. So where is everybody? Okay, here we come. There you go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So here's a question for everyone. Why can change, even small or even positive changes, come with such feelings of loss?
Oh, habit is so comforting, and familiar is a drug. Even in this pandemic, I'm one of these that's kicking and screaming through every step of it. I'm an extrovert by nature. It's incredibly challenging. But when I think about going back to work and facing traffic again and that commute, I get kind of all tight. And that's what I've been wanting. And yet, but it's changed. Now this has become familiar. This is what I do.
You know, and there's an old Russian proverb that I love. It's not that we love the old, it's that we fear the new. And sometimes it's just what's familiar is comforting, even sometimes in its negativity. And so it's so daunting to go into the unknown. That's losing the known, even if it is a negative or even a heinous experience, can be unsettling.
And that's a kind of loss right there, right? The unknown Absolutely. Is loss. I have a question for Jenna. Even though loss and grief is a human universal, I was wondering if you've ever found it hard to show such personal work to others, especially in a fine art or gallery setting. And they go on to say, it's a challenge emotionally to be so open and vulnerable. It's also often difficult to get folks to engage with this subject matter openly and critically. Can you speak to your experience of that?
Yeah, I still find myself apologizing sometimes to my family when I know that I'm about to speak very candidly in such a public forum. And they're supportive of me sharing my experiences and sharing this experience that we all shared. And so part of my confidence actually does come from my family and our ability to share. So I do come from a very lucky experience. But in my experience of sharing what I've gone through, what I'm afraid of, what my jeans are made of, more than just denim.
Oh, that was funny.
Oh, I find that overall I get back from people what I give, and I become addicted to that experience. I want to know how other people feel, and I think that part of being comfortable with openness is really craving openness from other people, and putting yourself out there is what opens other people up. It just does. And so if you find that you're a person who really wants that from other people and wants those kinds of experiences, you give a little, you give a lot.
I feel like I'm going to be the person who keeps quoting things, but
That's good. Keep them coming.
It's a wonderful line from Theodore Rothke. He who is willing to be vulnerable moves among miracles. And what you said made me think of that, Jenna.
Mm. And I think that so often the case is that the world feels like a very dangerous place. And one of the things you're saying, Jenna, is that if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we also make it a less dangerous place for ourselves, which
Very
seems
nice.
counterintuitive, you know, but so true.
Mhm.
All right, more questions. Here's a pretty tough one. How do you tell someone they're dying?
Ooh.
That might happen, right?
I have an opinion, but Michael probably has many times the experience.
Oh, I've never told anyone they're dying. I mean, that's something the doctors would do or not do, or a patient might say, do you think I'm dying? And I put the question back to them.
Mhm.
Do you think you're dying, and what makes you think so? And what would it mean if you do? How do we want to spend the rest of this time? So forth and so on. Yeah. But there are patients that don't want to know. There are cultures that you do not tell the patient. There was a fabulous movie this year earlier. I don't know if any of you saw it, a Chinese movie. What was it called? About the grandmother who had lung cancer, but nobody would tell her. Anyway,
Yes.
The farewell.
just the
Farewell. Thank you, Maya Lu.
farewell, where just culturally, we don't tell people. Whether we talk about it or not, the event's going to happen. So to me, it's the conversation about it and what it means to the person, and to be present for the sadness and the tragedy sometimes of it.
Mm.
I have found people will say it's easier when the person that it's happening to is allowed to have control. Some will say, I know I'm dying. And others, just as you said, Michael, don't want to. I've experienced that in my own family and with friends.
I'm sure in that moment, well, I'm not sure of anything, but that people want authenticity.
Mhm.
Well, maybe not.
What Georgia had said about the gang members smelling bullshit, I'd say somebody who's dying, facing cancer, more often than not can too detect that kind of authenticity. And
Mm. Mm.
Yes,
Um,
certain illnesses, it's happening. You know it's coming.
mm. How do we learn to delve deeper into loss in order to be present? What is the work of becoming present in the midst of loss? I think that's the question.
for me, I think some of it is having faith in that process.
Mm.
I trust that I move closer toward this. There will be something for me there on the other side. So I can try to avoid it, but then there's that, what's just not right inside? I'm not being real. This doesn't feel right. So developing a trust in the process, screwing up your courage to dive into it and see what the feeling is there. And sometimes it's like when you're a little kid and you're scared of the dark. Or I remember I couldn't have the closet door open because all my clothes hanging in the closet looked like skeletons and monsters. And I couldn't get out of the bed because there'd be some monster under the bed going to grab my feet. And then you turn the light on and it's just clothes in a closet. So sometimes it's just, this is loss. This is, yes, you're dying. Let's talk about it.
Mhm.
What does that mean?
Mm.
Um,
I go for it,
I
Jenna.
read poetry.
Mm.
Um, I
Yeah.
actually I keep a poem on my desk. I'll read it. I think once you start to open up, and once you start to see that you can be vulnerable and really face the many facets of loss and of dying, it's a fascination that I think just becomes richer with the more reading that you do and the more talking that you do about it. Um, if I could just read this poem really quick, it's short. It's by a rabbi, so excuse the Hebrew and the mention of the Torah. But When All That's Left Is Love by Rabbi Alan S. Mahler. When I die, if you need to weep, cry for someone walking the street beside you. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands and souls touch souls. You can love me most by sharing your simchas, goodness, and multiplying your mitzvot, acts of kindness. You can love me most by letting me live in your eyes and not on your mind. And when you say Kaddish for me, remember what our Torah teaches, love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. And
Beautiful.
this is not entirely my own personal perspective on loss and dying, but I appreciate keeping others' thoughts about it around.
Mm.
That is so beautiful. I would like to say in rejoinder to my previous comment, I don't want to come off at all glib like this is how you do it, because the larger question for me is grace, to be a human being. And so you don't just have this devastating loss and then, okay, I'm going to move into it and trust that I'm going to grow from it. That process might take 2 years, literally. I've had patients who get a stage 4 diagnosis, which by definition is not curable. 2 years later, they say, oh my God, the doctor says I'm going to die from this. This was news. And patients will often judge themselves for not being a good cancer patient. Why am I crying so much? Look at that patient over there. They've got it so much worse. And I've just got stage 1 breast cancer. But the image that comes to me a lot and used with patients is like a tsunami or something in the South Pacific wipes out a village. And you see people on the news wandering around. Not only is their house destroyed, their village is gone. There's no street left. And they kind of wander around in this daze, just trying to get their bearings in this new reality. That is a period of grace, getting your bearings in this new reality, and it might take years. But one of the gifts of that process is when you're sifting through the rubble, you get to decide what is it that you find that you want to keep. There's a picture of my grandma. I don't want to lose that. This I never liked anyway. I'll toss it. I never needed it. And you build a new house with the remnants. But it's a process. And in order to be in that process requires grace, which means allowance for my anger, my pain, my rage, my disappointment, all the rest.
I'm going to ask you another question. How do we mourn and prevent cultural loss?
Oh,
First,
Wow.
maybe let's just think about what cultural loss is, and then take it to the next step.
You know, as an anthropologist, it's one of the first things I learned about was the protection and the loss of culture. And this is somewhere that our elders, our ancestors, are so important and so integral to preserving and not having cultural loss. There are traditions that must be passed down across generations and preserved and maintained. And it is as simple and as difficult as that. And I think that it's something that you have to be intentional about and devote yourself to. And our ancestors and our elders, as I said, we need to hold on, we need to hold them close, we need to make them part of ensuring that culture is not lost. I feel so strongly. I feel they're often neglected. I feel they're often overlooked, not listened to, and at our own peril.
From another perspective, as a gay man looking at this in another way, the culture in many ways that I grew up in and the culture of generations before has been lost. And in a culture that is so youth worshiping, there isn't the reverence for elders and the wisdom. Any of the men in my generation who have lived through AIDS had a whole other baptism, indoctrination by fire into loss and what death and dying means that younger people have no clue about. It is sad. And yet that is also, there's kind of no such, I live in West Hollywood. West Hollywood used to be, I mean, you almost had to apologize or say, oh, you live in West Hollywood, then you must be gay. That kind of thing. Gay bars aren't as prevalent as they once were. The few lesbian bars that were here are gone. That's sad that there isn't that culture, and that some people would celebrate, well, there's the story of assimilation again, of any culture, which that's your department, Jorja. But
I mourn that as you say that those spaces, those are, for me, those are houses of worship. The gay bars, the lesbian, I mean, and I'm not trying to glamorize or sanitize what was also a terror-filled past, both in terms of stigma and death and life-threatening illnesses. And yet, oh my God, losing that cultural loss is unimaginable. And yet I think about individuals who trace their ancestry to slaves brought over on ships and trying to hold on to that culture as well. All of these, once again, all of these things intersect, and we need to find ways to sift through, honor, remember. It's, when I hear you say that, Michael, I want to go create an oral history of gay and lesbian elders. And it's just.
Speaking of a gay community, a queer community, we have another question that's about people of color. And this person says, I know how to persevere and accept things I cannot change, but I grieve and mourn the life I think I could have. I mourn for others who suffer like I do. Can you share thoughts on this particular kind of loss?
If it's something that you feel that this mourning can give you strength to mobilize, I feel that the most important thing with that feeling is to give back to your community and to be active in helping and in giving. And we talked earlier about immobilizing versus mobilizing grief. And I very much don't want to encourage anyone to go beyond kind of what they're able to do. But the advice I would give myself feeling that way is that I need to spend more time helping my community, and that in a way will give me the perspective to deal with that kind of loss. Not to be too prescriptive or anything.
I know that Patrisse Cullors spoke about the Black Lives Matter movement and talked about the spirituality that's also woven through that movement, and that her arts practice is about. So I think loss has multiple dimensions, both in terms of protest and also in terms of gathering together and understanding your next action. I didn't mean to jump in there, but I was thinking about her work. I have another question for you. I have so many questions for you. I feel like it's very hard to not expect and not want to be in control. So I think anger might be something inevitable when we experience loss. How do you think we should process that anger?
I'm going to say something too. I think that in American mainstream or Western mainstream culture, we are so caught up in the correct way to do things. And anger is not part of the correct way to do things, whether it's mourn or deal with the loss of control or face loss. And I think the first thing is allow. I think we need to allow for it, understand it, not try to repress it, but feel through it. Because I've seen a lot of damage done when people try to deny or clamp down on their anger. Allowing it, and that's not, unbridled expression, but allowing for it.
Is there any way to speed up the process of pain when losing something or someone you deeply care about?
If only.
Sometimes it gets
I
worse.
think the desire to speed it up only guarantees that the longer it's going to last. This is when I work with bereaved people, they often want to know, am I doing it right? As if there's a right way to do it. And how long will this last before I get over it? And so much of the work is you will never get over it. This loss is a part of you now. It's a part of your story. You'll carry it forever. You learn to carry it in a different way. And my desire to speed it up only reflects my judgment about it, that I shouldn't be feeling this sad. And our culture doesn't like us to feel anger. As Jorja said, it also doesn't like us to feel sad. I have people in my life that also just frame a question. How are you? Things good? I mean, that's leading the witness, Your Honor. So then I feel like I'm betraying them if I say I'm actually a pile of shit. And I know I was the last time I saw you too, and I'm sorry. And I'd love to be able to say that life is sweet, and it's not. And there are sweet moments, and thank you for asking. But when we say the allowance isn't only for us for that anger and disappointment and rage. It's, can we offer that grace to each other? It's like the Eeyore character in Winnie the Pooh, that they love him anyway, even though he's always all right, and life stinks. Okay, but we like you. We need that energy, that voice around to remind us that, life is shitty and it's beautiful. How do we live with both?
I think we have to be generous. I love what you're saying, Michael, because it's not only allowing ourselves, it's allowing others, instead of the stiff upper lip. Dear God, save me from the stiff upper lip. So we have to allow, and it is grace.
Yeah.
Right. And also
I have
change too. Because mourning changes, it goes through different kinds of cycles. Sorry, Victoria.
Oh, no, I just don't want this to end. I'm looking at it over on my right over here. There's so many beautiful, heartfelt questions, but I can see that we are the sand is filtering through that dial. So actually what I want to do is ask each of you to take a moment just to share with us what's on your mind right now as we close up this evening together. That.
Well, I'm going to jump out and go first, because I think I'd like to hear from Jenna and Michael in tying things up. I think for me, in thinking about loss, it is part of the greater mystery of life itself. And so it's, for me, there is no question but to give up control as much as I can and go into that mystery and be part of it. And it's what allows me not to do well with loss, but to have it there as part of my life and part of my understanding.
I would say share your loss, share your feelings. I know that seems very, very base, but the things that you can make and the people that you can bond with, if you just share what you're going through, it's important, and you can build so much just by being honest about how you feel, as Michael was saying earlier.
I love to travel. I'd spend my last nickel on a trip, and that's part of my sadness around this pandemic too. I've traveled to India a couple times, and often people say, oh, well, God, isn't the poverty overwhelming and it's so filthy and all the rest? And it's a mess. By and large, it's a mess. And I love it because it's so energizing, because it feels more genuine. Life is a mess. I'm a mess, you're a mess, my life's a mess. The sooner we come to peace with that, I feel more at ease. Okay, it's just a mess. It's never going to be tied up. I feel uneasy when I go to a place like Irvine, where everything's so perfect, I can't even tell if it's a gas station or not, because it's landscaped within an inch of its life. So
So specific.
we're all living in a mess right now, particularly, and we're all living with sadness. I'm very sad. This is Thanksgiving. I want to be with my sister on Thursday, and we can't. My mom died a year and a half ago. It's like, oh God, family, it's just gone. How many more of these do we have? I'm sad. Well, I can say, well, it's just a day I can withdraw my meaning from it. But we've all got our stuff this week. We want to be in school. We want to be with people. We want to celebrate a holiday. I want to be thankful. I don't feel thankful. That has to be okay too. But I am deeply grateful for everybody who showed up to this tonight, and that we can have a sense of truth-telling and community, even though I can't see faces.
Well, paradoxically, I think that while we were talking about loss, I feel as though you have filled a void with a tremendous amount of resilience and possibility. So thank each of you for tonight. This concludes this evening's program. We hope you'll join us again next week for What is Love? Same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu/10 questions. Thank you. And until next week, good night.